Okay, that's enough preamble. Let's move into the content for today. I'm just chairing, so I'm going to very quickly shut up and give the floor to our two speakers for the day. We have with us Professor Michael Robling, Dr. Jeremy Segrott from Cardiff University, both who have experience and expertise in trials, in social care, public health, drawing upon a wide range of experience, expertise to enable us to think this afternoon about conducting feasibility trials in social care. So a lot of what they're going to be presenting is very applicable, even though there might be examples from outside of the field. So please join me in welcoming Mike and Jeremy, and I look forward to seeing you on the other side. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Martin, and thank you for that introduction and also the invitation to present. And as you said, Martin, Jeremy and myself have a lot of interest in the use of feasibility studies, particularly in relation to evaluating complex interventions. And some of the work that we're going to be including in this presentation is from a project that was funded by the MRC Methodology Research Programme to produce guidance to researchers on the design of feasibility studies. So hopefully we'll be able to convey some of the sense and the learning from that in our talk today. So I'm just going to share the screen with you. So in this lunchtime session, what we're going to do is look in a bit more detail about what feasibility and pilot studies are. We're going to look at some of the design considerations, some of the things that you may want to choose to address in the design of a feasibility study. And we'll place some particular emphasis on what might be the key questions that you would want to ask and find answers to when undertaking feasibility studies. And these broadly break down into those which relate to the intervention itself, or the research methods that you would choose to be using in the definitive effectiveness study. And as part of looking at some of these underlying principles, what we're going to include are some previous examples of work that we've been involved in, which may sit outside adult social care, but we think have sort of strong messages for actually feasibility studies in a range of settings, including adult social care. We're also going to aim to leave sufficient time for any questions that you might have, because in many ways, this will be scratching the surface. We 45 minutes, there's a limit on how much we think we can cover. So we're trying to give you some sort of key pointers that you can then take away and think about further and look at the literature upon. It's worth, I think, saying where feasibility and pilot studies come into the grand scheme of things in terms of the life cycle of a research idea and testing innovation and new interventions. And this extract here is a quote from the MRC's guidance on the evaluation of complex interventions. And our focus is on complex interventions throughout this presentation. I work in a trials unit, and we actually undertake trials of pharmaceutical products as well. And maybe some of the principles of feasibility studies will apply equally to those settings, but our real attention here is on really quite complex interventions, which are likely to be the things that you will come across when working in adult social care too. And this recognizes, this quote recognizes that actually there's a long process involved in taking an idea for an intervention from its inception through to its final assessment as whether it's effective or not. And the risks associated with not paying sufficient attention to some of the activity required in those earlier and middle stages of the evaluation process. And really, I think it's about, if you cut corners in trying to develop and then evaluate an intervention, you don't pay sufficient attention to the likelihood of an intervention either working or the possibility of it being evaluated, then you're probably going to end up actually wasting time and wasting money. So there's a real emphasis on making sure that each stage of that development life cycle is sufficiently attended to by researchers. And I guess a key question that we can ask at this stage is, what would be the consequences of proceeding to a definitive evaluation, whether that's a randomized controlled trial or some other form of definitive evaluation using non-randomized methods? What are the pitfalls of moving too early or too quickly to that phase of evaluation without perhaps going through what we're going to be describing today as a sort of feasibility phase? And you probably have your own examples of where that's happened too early. I know that I do, but what we put together here are just some examples from studies that have been undertaken by the broader research team in Cardiff, particularly in sort of public health, where a definitive evaluation, a trial, has been undertaken without taking the opportunity or being afforded the opportunity to go through some form of feasibility testing or piloting of either the intervention or the evaluation methodology. The first example is of an exercise referral scheme which was rolled out across Wales. And really one of the problems here, the problem that was found in this definitive evaluation was actually the fidelity, delivering that particular intervention with fidelity. So it was not delivered as intended by those who had developed the intervention itself. So although you may have conducted in many ways a very good trial of that intervention, you weren't really testing the originally conceived idea. So we haven't really given that intervention and the theory of change underlying that intervention a proper test. The second example of a parenting program, the Strengthening Families program, succumbed to problems which are probably all too familiar to trialists, of failures to actually meet ongoing recruitment targets into that trial. And this led, in this circumstance, to the funding of this particular study being reviewed due to these sort of persistent failures. And actually, most trials at some point experience difficulties with recruitment. So it's natural that recruitment challenges are something that we might want to pay particular attention to in a feasibility phase of the development life cycle. A more extreme example at the end is a study of weight loss maintenance in adults, where in fact funding was terminated because of fundamental problems in recruitment into that study. So recruitment issues are common reasons to look at feasibility, and they can be serious enough to either delay and extend the cost and time of studies, or even to terminate them early. So these are the sorts of things that may happen if you don't take the opportunity to undertake some form of feasibility assessment. However, one of the things that I think has been problematic for researchers is that actually funding has not necessarily been available to undertake high quality feasibility studies. So in many ways, researchers have been forced to go too quickly to that definitive evaluation stage. But we're really pleased that the picture now has changed, and that major funders in the UK, like NIHR, are more likely to see studies themselves as actually essential. And we have locally and nationally, there are plenty of examples of really high quality feasibility studies which are now put in place to avoid some of the longer term the problems that occur longer down the track with studies which don't go through that particular phase. These studies, of course, may be, because they're smaller scale, will be cheaper to run than full trials, but they can still be expensive. So it's not necessarily a low cost or no cost option, and I think we should recognise that. One of the things that you may identify in the feasibility phase is that the intervention just is not at all suited for its delivery context. This is possibly something that should have really been picked up in an earlier phase of development, but it is something that we may identify within a feasibility stage. It probably is also reflective of the fact that there still remains relatively little money available to do that basic intervention development work. So sometimes that gets wrapped up in a feasibility study or even undertaken as part of a definitive trial. But I think there's now broader acceptance that feasibility or pilot studies are usually advisable to precede full-scale evaluations. So feasibility studies sit midway through this life cycle of intervention, development and evaluation, as encapsulated in this diagram from the MRC's framework document. We're talking here about the middle section entitled exploratory trial, and at the bottom phase 2 trial. And the focus here is about trying to identify and describe components of an intervention and putting together what might be a feasible protocol for evaluating that intervention in a trial against a viable alternative. And this follows on from the basic theoretical and modelling work that needs to happen to confirm what that intervention actually is, but precedes the definitive randomised controlled trial. So it's very, very much a critical stage on the pathway to long-term evaluation. But one of the things that you may notice is that if you sort of scan the literature in this area, is that there's a variety of terminology being used. So there are references to feasibility studies or trials, pilot studies, phase 2 trials, as we saw in the previous figure, exploratory trials. So sometimes that terminology can be confusing for researchers and for readers. So, and indeed, there are some inconsistencies in the way that funders refer to feasibility and pilot phases. So the MRC themselves will refer to a single stage of feasibility and piloting. The NIHR, I think, usefully separates into two domains, those which are feasibility studies, which are activities undertaken before a main study to answer the question, can this study be done? Pilot studies are themselves a smaller version of the main trial or the main study, and there the focus is on testing whether all of the necessary components for that trial will work together as a whole. So it's a mini trial. It'll look very much like the intended definitive evaluation. But neither of these two documentary, two sets of guidance, is there much attention paid on the evaluating the feasibility of the intervention itself. They're more focused on establishing some of the methodological parameters required for the definitive trial. So I think the focus that we have taken really is that, that whether we're talking about feasibility piloting, it's work that's effectively conducted after the initial intervention development work has been completed. So we need to have a substantive intervention in place before we can proceed to a feasibility study. And it's work that's necessary to be done prior to implementing the definitive effectiveness study, which actually tests whether that intervention actually works in practice. And the key questions we're really asking in a feasibility study are, is the intervention itself feasible, and is the evaluation design that we're choosing to use in the definitive trial, is that feasible too? And to note, although there may be a lot of talk in this presentation about trials, we're not solely talking about randomized controlled trials. So if your definitive evaluation of effectiveness is going to be say quasi-experimental approach or observation study, then the feasibility study for that may have a slightly different focus in terms of its design. So it's really just any preparatory work that's necessary before you proceed on to that definitive evaluation stage. And I've just, I think this is quite a useful reference for those of you who want to sort of go away and look at in a bit more detail about what feasibility studies, how feasibility and pilot studies interact. Overall, we're talking about uncertainty. So a feasibility study is about addressing uncertainties, either relating to the intervention or the evaluation design. Pilot studies are one form of feasibility study. It's one that mimics the look of a full-scale trial, and that might be conducted either as an internal pilot, i.e. it's encompassed as part of the main trial design, and the data generated in that internal pilot will be included in the main analysis for that trial. And it may have a very specific focus, which might be to try and provide confidence about, for example, the ability to recruit at sufficient scale into a trial. Or a pilot may be external, so we're not intending to include data from that pilot in the main analysis, but it provides us with information about other parameters necessary to establish before we move on to a definitive trial. So feasibility studies can encompass pilots, but not necessarily, and they can be randomized if randomization is an important focus of a feasibility study, but they can also be non-randomized or even picking up on very specific aspects of feasibility. And they could be quite small scale if that's where the uncertainty lies. So, and what are the sorts of things that we would need to consider in a feasibility trial? Well, we've talked about intervention feasibility, its acceptability to stakeholders, either those receiving the intervention or delivering the intervention. And this may, and answering these questions may lead us to either make small refinements to the programme, or it might be looking at the degree to which the intervention itself actually reaches the population of to whom it's intended to be delivered to, and whether that is then received and engaged with at adequate levels by that population. Facets of the evaluation design that we might focus on might include aspects of data collection. We might be testing randomization, for example, the feasibility or the acceptability of randomization. If our main evaluation method is a randomized control trial, but equally it may be focused particularly on recruitment and retention. And if we're using randomization, one aspect that we might be interested in particular is the likelihood and the consequences of contamination between study arms. So in summary, an intervention needs to exist before we can proceed to a feasibility study. We need to have an underlying theory about what that intervention is, and this is established in that developmental work. We then will test the acceptability and the feasibility of that intervention, and we may make some refinements to it, but we're not really talking about large-scale changes. Similarly, we might be testing aspects of the evaluation design which might need to be modified before we proceed to a main trial. And here I hand over to Jeremy, I think.
Thanks very much, Mike. I'm going to look in a bit more detail at some of these key questions that we might want to ask about both the feasibility of the intervention that we're concerned with, but also the feasibility of the evaluation design and research methods. So I'll start with the intervention and then move on to the research methods and evaluation design. And we might start by thinking about the intervention and its feasibility and asking ourselves within a feasibility study, is it actually feasible to deliver the intervention? And sometimes you'll see that that is probably not much more than a check on whether all of the components are fully delivered. But it might well be helpful and quite valuable to go in a bit deeper than that, to think about using a mixed methods approach, to think about what it means for the intervention to be delivered as intended. So what are the mechanisms that support the current problem that we're trying to interrupt or change through the intervention? And are those going to hold equally across different settings? So might the intervention require perhaps slightly different activities or actions to achieve its aims across settings? So we're interested in whether, I guess, and how an intervention might interact with different contexts in slightly different ways. Does the theory of the intervention hold across different settings? We can also often pick up things that we didn't expect, so potentially unexpected processes, aspects of the logic model that perhaps we hadn't anticipated, perhaps processes that were unexpected and need to be added to our understanding of our intervention logic model. And also we can pick up on potentially harmful processes that the intervention might give rise to. And that's important because then we can refine our intervention logic model, both to understand how the intervention interacts with different contexts, but also to hopefully prevent any potential harmful processes as we go forward to the next stage of our evaluation. And so many of the questions that we will have asked during the initial intervention development phase, when we were trying to understand how our intervention works, can be revisited, because within a feasibility study, we're typically looking at implementing the intervention in a wider range of settings. We'll talk a little bit now about intervention acceptability, starting off with the implementers, so the individuals and the organizations that are going to deliver the intervention. And again, I guess at one level, we could just ask, is the intervention acceptable to delivery agencies? But arguably we can and we need to go a bit deeper than this. And to ask actually, does the intervention have the potential to become a normalized part of everyday functioning in the systems it aims to change? So for instance, if we're asking, say, a team within local authorities to implement an intervention, is this likely to be something that will become integrated and taken on and sustained over the longer term? Traditionally, often people worry about those kind of questions once they know whether an intervention works. But we could argue, well, what's the point of knowing that something works if it could never be scaled up and sustained? And this really, I guess, gets us to think about the system and how systems change, and how often an intervention is bringing about change in a system. It's asking people to do things in new ways, to change the way that they do things. And sometimes changes within those systems are resisted, and acceptability isn't just a fixed thing that is unchanging. So we need to know and understand how over time and how over different kinds of settings, the intervention is likely to be either integrated and accepted or not. So really thinking about intervention scalability and sustainability. And as Mike touched on earlier, we need to think about the acceptability of the intervention that we've developed for the participants who we're expecting to receive it. And we're interested in whether enough participants engage with the intervention for it to be likely in a future evaluation, full definitive evaluation, to have an impact. But again, we probably want to go beyond a very binary assessment. So for instance, X% of participants in the feasibility study found the intervention acceptable, because there are actually some important questions that we can ask that can help us to more fully understand acceptability and optimize it for the future. So can we actually improve acceptability through minor alterations to the intervention, or is a fundamental rethink needed? Is there patterning in acceptability? So is the intervention more or less acceptable to certain groups? And is there the possibility that we could actually increase health inequalities because of that different level of acceptability across different groups? And so can we refine the intervention to minimize the risk of widening health inequalities? And these are the kind of questions that if we can address them now, we can avoid having potentially harmful effects through increasing health inequalities once we proceed to a full definitive evaluation. And we'll move on now to look at a bit about the feasibility of the proposed evaluation method that we have. We're interested in whether our proposed methods that we'll use for our future definitive study are feasible, can they be undertaken, and are they acceptable to participants? And I guess here acceptability covers a number of different aspects, such as the time needed from participants to complete data collection procedures, but also the mode of data collection and actually how the data is collected. If we're planning to use a randomized controlled trial design, and if at this stage we identify that randomization is highly unacceptable, then we can then identify that we have some pretty serious risks of poor recruitment or subversion of the randomization process within a future trial if we proceed with one. If we decide that we're going to use another approach, so quasi-experimental methods, in the feasibility study, we can actually evaluate the feasibility of the method that we'd use for deriving a comparator. So it's a really important step, this, I guess, in terms of understanding actually how feasible it is to conduct a randomized controlled trial and how acceptable that design is. And we can also use the feasibility stage to evaluate the feasibility and the practicality of whatever data collection procedures that we're planning to use, such as questionnaires and interviews. We've talked already a bit about recruitment and retention and how important those can be as challenges within full-scale evaluations. And in feasibility studies, looking at the feasibility of recruitment is really a critical aim of many feasibility studies. So based on our feasibility study, we can have some sense, and often quite a good sense, of within a future definitive study, what might be the recruitment rates, and also what might be the retention rate. So how likely are we to be able to follow up participants after so many months? And also, can we actually improve those recruitment and retention strategies that we've used? So not just how many parents do we think, for instance, we could recruit in a study, but other ways of improving that. And also actually how much would it cost to increase our recruitment and our retention within a future definitive study. And at the developmental stage, or the previous stage of the kind of intervention development, we will have, in all likelihood, have developed some kind of logic model. So by the time we begin our feasibility study, we will have hopefully a pretty good idea of what we think the intervention is designed to achieve in terms of outcomes and the key mechanisms. And in a feasibility study, we can actually do some work looking at which outcomes we would need to measure in order to test the logic model within a future definitive study, and whether those outcomes are available and if they are well validated. And also actually where those outcome measures have been used in previous studies. So when were they used, where, and with whom were those measures potentially validated? So for instance, in the example here, if we have a questionnaire measure that was validated in the 1980s in the United States, it may not work very well if we have a very different population in the UK, say in 2007 or 2021. And if we're not completely confident that we have good enough measures at this point, we may well have some time to develop or revalidate candidate measures for the specific group that we're going to collect them from. And even if a measure has been used many times before, we have an important chance here to reassess its validity within the context that we're going to be working within. And then finally, and perhaps most controversially, there's quite a lot of debate about whether feasibility studies should look at whether interventions have the potential to be effective. And you'll notice the italics there for the word potential. The original MRC guidance did advocate the use of feasibility trials to estimate effect sizes and power for a future trial. But there's a lot of contestation and discussion around this. And there are a number of risks of using a feasibility study to estimate either the likely effect sizes of the intervention and also the necessary sample sizes, and also using a feasibility study to look at whether an intervention may be effective. And if we go to the next slide, I'll just show you some of the key concerns that have been raised. So a feasibility study isn't actually powered to estimate an effect size. So if we use a feasibility study to do that and to estimate the likely effect size of our intervention, there is a strong chance that those estimates could actually be pretty inaccurate because we've got very wide confidence intervals. And then the risk is that we either use that information, which is inaccurate, to generate either a very underpowered or a very overpowered trial in the future with all the problems that come with that. The other key risk here is that the effects that we might potentially identify, or potential effects within a feasibility study, it's hard to know to what extent they'll be reflected in a full evaluation where there's much greater heterogeneity in terms of settings and other aspects of the trial. So probably better to decide what would be a meaningful effect in social care terms and then power our future trial or study to detect that. We can also look at previous studies of similar interventions that can provide important information about what kind of effect size we're likely to see and therefore likely to use for our power calculations in a full study.
Okay, thank you, Jeremy. And all of this information gathering that we've been describing here from a feasibility study is really about informing decision-making about progression to a definitive study. So what do we need? How do we do that? How do we make that decision? We would normally see that there are a range of criteria that we would set ourselves from a feasibility study before we could proceed onto that definitive study. So these will be set by the uncertainties that we identified at the beginning of the feasibility study. At the moment, there isn't really good guidance about how to operationalize such progression criteria, but there's a lot of good, I think, custom and practice in this area. We think that having a priori criteria for progression is important, but maybe we need to be cautious about defining those criteria too narrowly, for example, reducing it down to a simple metric like the proportion or numbers recruited into a feasibility study. Similarly, there may be dangers about specifying criteria too broadly, i.e. the intervention is generally acceptable, because actually, if you're taking a mixed methodological approach, you're likely to find some evidence that in favour of that, as well as some evidence that's not in favour of that view. Overly demanding criteria or easily achievable criteria, therefore, are both potential sources of problems. And of course, we may have a number of uncertainties that we want to address with the feasibility study. So we may want to impose some kind of prioritization. So there are certain criteria which are going to be most important, and there'll be other criteria which may be informative and useful, but maybe less critical in making a decision about progression. And I think, you know, to express a note of caution here, we think that it's probably important not to be too reductionist and too quantitative in our approach, although quantitative criteria are probably still nevertheless useful. But having criteria in advance avoids the risk of some kind of post hoc rationalization on behalf of the research team. But it's worth noting that the criteria and the thresholds for these criteria may have relatively little scientific basis. It's really a judgment, a judgment of experts, and may not necessarily provide absolute certainty about what may happen in the definitive evaluation phase. And rather, I think we should see the feasibility study as an important formative stage preceding the definitive trial. And that means making the best use of a range of research methodology, including maybe in particular qualitative approaches, to understand both facets of the intervention, but also the evaluation design and how we can perhaps tweak that prior to a definitive trial. We've mentioned using the feasibility study as a way of making some modifications to the logic model, the ideas behind the intervention, and avoiding some of the potential pitfalls that might be unexpectedly arise from the intervention. But ultimately, even if you have well-written progression criteria, this is likely to be a judgment made by a team of people about whether it's worthwhile proceeding onto the definitive stage. And I think that another thing to bear in mind is to ask yourself, or a question to ask yourself, is whether really all of the key uncertainties have actually been addressed, either prior to the feasibility stage study, or within the feasibility study, and to make sure that there isn't another key area of potential concern that we simply haven't given any consideration to. So that's the elephant in the room analogy. We can focus on those things we've measured and ignore the things that actually might be more critical when it comes to the large-scale trial. We think it's good practice to have an independent body to advise the research team. So if you have a trial steering committee who could fulfill that function, who are there to assess the evidence produced from that feasibility study and to provide you with their advice on the decision to proceed or not. And that decision may be straightforward based on the evidence from the feasibility study. It might be that, yes, you proceed happily with the full-scale evaluation, or maybe more fundamentally, you need to go back and rethink the intervention itself or the approach to the evaluation. But there may also be a middle ground. There are sort of amber lights on the traffic lights, where actually with some reasonable modifications to your approach, you feel you could still progress satisfactorily to the main trial. It's worth noting, though, that this process can be very much driven by the researchers, and so there may be a bias in favour of continuing to evaluate this particular innovation. And again, I think that's where objective criteria can be really helpful. Just before we finish, we've got about 6 minutes before we come to the end of our time. I'm going to have a look at 2 example feasibility studies to try and put some of these ideas into more concrete terms. The first of which was a study which was led out of Cardiff, which was evaluating a home visiting programme, specialist home visiting scheme aimed at teenage mothers, which had previously been trialled by the Cardiff team, and which followed up these families until children were 2 years old. And the intention of this newly designed study was to actually undertake a long-term evaluation of the same families, but using solely administrative data from a variety of different data sources. So the evaluation design is a trial cohort using linked routine data. And these data sets came from social care, education, health, and also incorporated the original trial data set. And to do this study, the data model that was being constructed relied on participant descent. So we were not offering participants the informed consent approach. It was people had to register their dissent if they didn't want their records to be included. And we were linking up these routine records to existing trial data and accessing it using a process of remote data access. And in the feasibility study here, we asked a number of questions, and these were formally set criteria that we agreed with our funder to allow us to proceed on from the feasibility study. The first of which was, is the descent model that we've constructed for this particular study, is that actually adequate? Is that acceptable to relevant stakeholders? And to assess that, we looked both at rates of women who opted out, who used that descent approach, but also we sought qualitatively the views of stakeholders, so from members of that population, to find out what they thought about the suitability of that approach. We needed to look at whether the linkage model itself would, whether we could link data with sufficient validity and with sufficient rates. So were the match rates between with the different data sets used in that study likely to be sufficient to answer with credibility the answers, the questions we were setting ourselves in that study? And is the data quality itself adequate? So for our primary and secondary outcomes in that study, were we actually getting sufficient numbers of valid values back? And I'm pleased to say that against all three of these sort of principal criteria, we were able to affirmatively answer the question and proceed on to the main study. But that's an example of a non-RCT preceded by a feasibility study. The second example is an evaluation, what was intended to be a trial of GPS devices for people with dementia, where the intervention comprised a local authority or provider supplied GPS device which permitted, or which was to facilitate safe walking, and for which any individual taking part in the study concerned, there would be a pre-specified, defined, personalised geographical boundary, so an area within which all stakeholders considered would be a suitable boundary for walking. And the evaluation design was a trial, and it was particularly focused actually on the health and social care resource use associated with that. And in the feasibility study, they were focusing on different ways of collecting information about resource use using a participant survey, a participant diary, or patient records, electronic health records, for example. And they were also asking questions about the range of potential outcome measures for both participant and carer quality of life. So those were the key questions answered in the being asked in the feasibility study. And again, the feasibility study of this intervention and this trial design used a range of methods. Used interviews with stakeholders to look at the perceived value of the intervention, the understanding the concept of safe walking for those stakeholders, the acceptability of the different measures that were being chosen between for the study, and also the response rates and the estimates of resource used against the three different forms of collecting information about resource. And whilst in this study that they anticipated that they might have 50 participants in the feasibility study, in fact they ended up with 20, which I think was an indication to them of some of the real challenges in identifying an adequately sized number of people to take part in the definitive trial. So just closing now, I think it's worth remembering that even if your feasibility study that shows that it's not worth immediately proceeding onto a definitive trial, you will still have spent quite a lot of money in doing so, but you're likely to have saved a lot of money in doing so as well. So you're avoiding the cost of spending a lot of money on a large-scale trial, which is going to run into fundamental problems. Terminating the development process early because of a feasibility study is not therefore a failure. I mean, it's a positive way of understanding what will or will not work. And the most useful feasibility study, I think, will give you strong indications about what can be modified to allow you to progress further with that innovation. So just in summary, we strongly feel that a feasibility study is essential before embarking on a large-scale definitive trial where you have existing uncertainties. If in fact you, as a research team or as a funder, you feel that there are no ongoing uncertainties, then a feasibility study may be either not required or not at a scale that you might originally anticipate. Key feasibility questions address intervention, feasibility and scalability, as well as evaluation design. And a lot of focus has been put on evaluation design as being the purpose of feasibility studies, but actually testing that intervention in practice is equally important. And in both cases, looking at what can be tweaked before to allow you to move on to a definitive evaluation. And really utilizing a range of research methods will be most helpful rather than the reliance on, say, more quantitative or solely qualitative methods. And these can be jointly combined to inform decision making about progression. And I think that's it from us. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Mike and Jeremy. That was an incredibly clear, really insightful walkthrough in terms of feasibility studies, which hopefully has generated a number of questions, conversation points for us to focus on in the last quarter of an hour. So there's one in the chat already, which I'm going to pick up on, but please do put questions in the chat or pop your video on and then just wave at me or raise a hand in the hand raise function. But we're going to go to M. Louthian, who asked a question, where is this taken from? I think it was one of the early graphics that you put up, but Em, I wondered if you can just say what you're referring to here.
Hi, yeah, sorry, I've got a meeting in 2 minutes, but I'm glad that you finished in time. Yeah, I just really liked the phase 1, phase 2, etc., going from sort of the beginning point to a full intervention, because for me, I'm looking at existing parenting interventions for children who are vulnerable and parents who have existing mental health problems or substance use problems. I'm looking at kind of developing those interventions with quantitative data and informing them is something that Jeremy's involved in. And I was just, wherever that's taken from, it probably includes more stuff that's going to be useful for me. So I was just wondering if you could give me that reference.
Yeah, so that figure was taken from the MRC's guidance document on developing and evaluating complex intervention.
Most obvious one then.
But I mean, as I mentioned, that guidance is in the process of being revised and updated, and some of the work that Jeremy and I have been involved in is feeding into, or has fed into that redrafting. But yeah, that's the place to look for that. Is there anything else you want to add, Jeremy, in terms of?
Just to say that actually it's 2 versions ago that diagram comes from, and it's about to be updated, as you say, Mike, but the previous version has actually got a slightly revised version of that diagram, which kind of shows it as being slightly less linear and more cyclical. Yeah. So I suppose the earlier linear one is in some ways more helpful to get your head around. The later one actually just kind of helps us to think that it's not just a one stop. You do the first stage and the second stage, you might actually have a bit of to and fro.
Okay, well, thank you so much. That was really interesting.
Thanks, Em, for your question. Mike and Jeremy, is there any news on that update? It's been in the process of being updated for the last 2 years, but do you know when it's going to be published?
Short answer, no. We have a meeting later this week on that, related to that, so we might be, we're not directly responsible for drafting it, so we can't be more definitive than that, I'm afraid.
Okay, no problem. Jonathan, got your hand up.
Hi, thanks for the very interesting presentation, guys. I'm just thinking about the publishability really of pilot studies and feasibility studies, just in terms of, so for example, you carry out, say, a pilot study on an intervention, it's a small sample, and what you actually learn from doing it is that that's not the way to do it, and there are lots of other things that you need to do in order to make it work. So how publishable would a study like that be? Because actually the information may be useful for other researchers who are in similar work.
Well, I think you've answered your own question. If it's going to be useful for other researchers, then I think that makes it publishable. And we are starting to see a lot of publications actually from good quality feasibility studies, which are extremely helpful, and specialist journals for feasibility studies as well. So I think that if you've it might be a smaller scale study, it might be identifying problems as well as providing solutions, but those things are really quite helpful, I think, to other researchers, and who may avoid some of the pitfalls that you've encountered in that feasibility study, and who can benefit more quickly with identifying problems that might be applicable to their own setting. And one of the things that we spend a lot of time talking about in the work that we have done is about what is an uncertainty. And sometimes when you're sitting down designing a feasibility study, you see things being put in there, research questions being put in there, which we say need to be answered in that feasibility study. But actually, on closer scrutiny, you realise they've already been resolved. We know what's going to happen when it comes to when we try and randomise in a particular setting. We know what works or doesn't work. So actually, the value of publishing those feasibility studies is contributing to what we already know works, and where we are uncertain about what will work in the future. So I think they're very publishable if all things being equal, definitely.
All right, thanks.
Thanks for the question, and thank you, Carol, for popping up in the chat a link to the BMC journal, which does just that. So that's really helpful. Madeline, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, hi. I just wanted to ask, I may have misunderstood, but a bit more about one of the examples that you mentioned about motivational interviewing. I think it was Jeremy. I think you were using it as an example of a feasibility trial showing that an intervention was not scalable. Is that correct? And if so, could you just say a bit more about that?
Yeah, I think the general point we're making there is that there are certain kinds of, behavior change techniques or intervention approaches that we know are, in their general sense, effective. But actually, one key challenge then is, can you actually embed them within kind of complex organizations? So to give you an example of some of the work that I've been involved with, if you've got a kind of a parenting intervention or family support intervention and you're bringing it into, say, a kind of a local authority, is it going to be supported? Are people going to be willing to implement it, and will it be sustained, and can it be scaled up? So I think that was the sort of point we were trying to make, that it's looking at, we want to sort of use approaches that we think in general are effective, but also we want to pay attention to actually, will it be feasible, and is it likely that they would be adopted fully and then implemented in the way that we want them to be.
Okay, so there wasn't a study that tried to do that, a feasibility trial of motivational interviewing, is that right? And they found that it wasn't implementable on that scale.
I think there are some examples there of where it had been found that it wasn't implemented in its kind of as intended. So actually, it was an evidence-based approach, but actually the key issue was implementation within the setting. So it was drawing on that. Yeah. So the answer is yes. It was an example where something might well have been effective if it had been implemented fully. And then I guess the question is how it interacted with the existing system.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Very useful.
Thanks for the question. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you have other questions? While we're considering a question, I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about how researchers could avoid pro-innovation bias. And you mentioned about having clear criteria, having a independent trial committee, but and I guess it links a little bit into the publication question. How can you avoid the criticism of researcher kind of over-involvement and over-investment in the success of the intervention at feasibility stage?
I think, well, I think having as explicit a criteria as possible will be helpful, and having having that external independent oversight from a steering committee who I think my experience generally is that they will tell you if they have a concern about the need, the ability to progress. We've identified and shared with funders progression criteria, and they've also pushed us back on some of what we're suggesting would be reasonable progression criteria, and by proxy, I guess, their reviewers, their panel members. I think sometimes there's a tension that might exist between innovation developers themselves who might be outside of the academic team. So it might be local authority team who've developed, or a clinical team who've developed an innovation, and they're actually having the academic partners is an opportunity to have a more critical perspective on what they're doing. So they will be most invested in the success of that innovation, and we as a research team can probably be a little bit more objective. So having if you like, layering that oversight, from the innovator to the evaluation team to the independent oversight to funders, basically just making explicit the case for progression or not progression.
Thanks very much. We've just got a couple of minutes, so 1 minute for Martin, and then we'll have 1 minute from Carol.
Okay, so it follows on from points from Martin and Jonathan. In social care side, it's often quite difficult to persuade people to participate in studies, whether it's organisations, providers, individuals. And if you're trying to persuade them to take part in a feasibility study, which is not going to generate findings necessarily of value in its own right, is there a way around that? Is there a way of saying this is still feasibility, don't rush away and implement what we find, but can we generate something for you from that feasibility study which you can take away and find useful? I guess that's the point.
I think my guess is that it's probably not difficult to get people involved. I think they see the value, the potential value in the innovation. So, and they will have an interest, I think, in the subject matter or the intervention itself. So usually people are quite, I think, prepared to be involved. The other part of what you said about going away from that feasibility study and trying to implement without any further evaluation, I think that's the thing that's more challenging, is sort of perhaps tempering the enthusiasm to just roll it out when there's, at that stage, only modest evidence of effect, if you like. So I think that's where, and again, I think just being really clear about what you're aiming to achieve with that feasibility study is important. But yeah, I think people are involved, and sometimes they might be over involved in taking it further subsequently.
Okay, final question from Carol in the chat. Are there examples of participatory action research in social care feasibility studies? Is there a stronger component of patient-public involvement in these than perhaps there is in healthcare trials? Any quick responses to that one?
Hard to comment on whether one or other sector has greater levels of input into, in terms of a service user perspective into the design of the intervention or the evaluation. We see, we see very good examples of public involvement in co-producing and co-designing interventions in sort of public health settings, but I know that exists in children's social care where I do a lot of work as well. So, and I think that, you know, we would see that sort of co-production, co-design as really being the bedrock of providing a very firm, solid basis for innovation within social care and in healthcare.
Okay, we're going to have to close. It's 2 o'clock. So on behalf of SSCR, I just want to say a huge thank you to Jeremy and Mike. It's been a really informative and interesting conversation over the last hour. And thank you everyone for attending. We've got our next webinar in 2 weeks on mental health measurement, I believe. So please do sign up for that one in advance. Yeah. Huge thank you all around. See you soon.
Thank you.